this is a so-called affiliated session or bonus session in my mind. After we set up this Global Commons Forum, we realized there is another very important summit ongoing in Australia, the Global Nature Positive Summit. It's a very attractive title. And actually, I realized that we are actually competing with each other to get the panelists of those two forums. And actually, one of the team member of the Mountain Project is on the other side, the Australian side, and he suggested, he's actually the CEO of the where is it? The Capitalist Coalition, that he suggested that we could have linked up so that we can compare notes. That's how this session was structured. I wonder, is this already on? Okay, let me see that if Andrew and Mark, can you hear us? Good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Yeah. So on this end, we do have actually the Peter Bakker and the Johan Rockstrom. Can you see them? Not really?
Yes, we certainly
Oh,
can.
good. All right. Okay. So good. So that I just explained to my audience that why we are having this bonus affiliated session, because the topics are so deeply related, both of them very important, global commons on this end and nature positive on your end. So that it's really good opportunity for us to share the takeaway and also to reflect, and also that if possible to think about what is going to be the expectation on your side, and then because you do have 2 more days to go, right? And we just finished our forum, so so that then maybe it's good to also hear from you that what you expect for next 2 days. So with that, then my audience knows who we are, so that then maybe on your side, maybe Andrew, you could actually that then take over my mic and explain who you are, and then then how to kick off.
Happy to, and thank you, Naoko. So Andrew Peterson, and I'm the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. We're part of the WBCSD Global Network, and we have a membership of about 85 members here in Australia, including business, but also academia, government, and some NGOs. And we're here at the very first Global Nature Positive Summit, and I'm here with my colleague from Capitals Coalition, Mark Goff. Let me also, because we're coming to you from Australia, open by acknowledging that we are broadcasting to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we will be talking about the significance of what that means shortly in the conversation about what's going on here in Australia. So Naoko, I want to hand back to you because I think Johan is going to kick us off with a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. From this end, you have 2 big gifts to you. One is a presentation by Johan, the latest science, that the planetary boundary science, which your side might have missed. So then followed by maybe Peter Bakker, that how the business community wanna actually cope with that, or how to operationalize that science. So if it's okay, that then we start with Johan, followed by Peter. All right? Okay.
Is it possible to... look at this. Fantastic. Okay, thanks. So what I will do, and for those of you who were here this morning, there will be a bit of a repetition, but we know that repetition is the mother of all knowledge, so that's a good thing. And sharing with you guys down under, I think that can be good. What I try to do here is to take an Earth system science approach to nature positive. Now, I just want to give a little bit of background here that when I, this morning, made clear from the Anthropocene evidence, the tipping point science, and the Holocene stability as the unique reference point for the planet we depend on, that is all fundamentally based on Earth resilience, but it also connects directly to the insight that we have to now urgently be stewards of the remaining biodiversity, life support in the living biosphere on land and in the ocean, and that this is a piece of science that we very actively contributed to the run-up to the COP15 and the Montreal Kunming gathering, which gave us the global biodiversity framework. And I think both of you in Australia, but perhaps several in the room, were part of that network in the world, the science-driven network in the world, that built up the whole argument around nature positive. And so that's quite interesting how the planetary boundary science and the Earth system research helped also in advancing the evidence why we need a nature positive future. And I'll be defining nature positive before I come to an end here. But as I mentioned this morning, the fundamental entry point here is that we're now at risk of threatening the stability of the whole Earth system. It's all about functioning life support, and it's translated in Earth resilience, and Earth resilience being the capacity of the Earth system to buffer and dampen and take stress and punches, everything from natural stress, from earthquakes and different volcanic eruptions of natural variability, but increasingly, as we all know, human interference. Now, Earth resilience can be measured in very many ways, but the red thread is to look at the feedback dynamics in the Earth system. And many of these feedbacks that we depend on are what science called negative feedbacks, which is not a very pedagogic term, I realize, because science loves negative feedbacks. That's the best feedback we have, because negative feedbacks means the capacity to buffer, to dampen, to reduce. That's why they're negative. Positive feedbacks are those that amplify and intensify and push us in the wrong direction. What you have here is the Global Carbon Project's annual update of the global carbon cycle, which is one of these resilience buffering indicators, which is one way of aggregating the role of biodiversity and nature. I put this specifically on here because this is actually led by an Australian colleague. I'm sure you're well familiar and friendly with him, Pep Canadell. It's a fantastic project, and it gives us the hockey stick of fossil fuel burning measured across all sectors in the world in red, deforestation in yellow. Is it all of this that has caused the climate crisis we're in today? The answer is no. That we have this nature subsidy to the global economy in dark green and the ocean uptake of carbon, and light green the uptake in intact nature on land. So agriculture is a net source, and that's the biggest land system change on land. So what you see here is the biodiversity and the remaining wetlands and grasslands and forests that are absorbing another 25%. So it's only the blue wedge which has caused the 1.2 degrees Celsius warming we see so far. And unfortunately, we have so much science that shows that we're losing this resilience, that we are losing biodiversity, losing forest systems at a pace that is threatening the temperate forests in Europe and in North America. We're seeing increasingly losing carbon uptake capacity in Siberia and the boreal forest in Scandinavia, and most dramatically, the Amazon basin, which is now in the Brazilian part no longer carbon sink, it's a net carbon source, not only because of heat and droughts and changes in precipitation, but also because of loss of biodiversity and deforestation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirms this, stating clearly that we are causing climate change, we're threatening planetary stability, but also depending on biodiversity. Isn't that interesting that the climate science has now come to a point where it's recognizing that the only way to solve the climate crisis is by combining an energy transition, decarbonizing the global economy, and investing in nature, building, protecting, restoring, and regenerating biodiversity. This is because this is the toolbox, the biological toolbox for the stability of the climate system. So we've come to this point. This is the new, let's say, dynamics that we have to start understanding, that when we're losing Earth resilience because of our transgression of planetary boundaries and lowering biodiversity, the functioning of biomes on planet Earth, it leads to increasing risk of crossing tipping points. And when we cross tipping points, that will intensify and take us into a virtuous cycle of increasing drift away from sustainable conditions. And this can happen even without us doing anything. If we burn too much fossil fuels and we start crossing tipping points, the planet will self-propel itself in this circle. And that is the biggest fear we have, that the planet would self-reinforce itself through Earth system feedbacks. And the biggest worry there is that we do that in biology. Now, we have done the first risk assessment of when are we at risk of crossing tipping points. Here you have the 16 tipping point systems that we today have mapped that regulates the state of the climate system. So this is climate science, but look at that list. Here you have the ice sheets, you have the big marine systems, coral reef systems, you have the Amazon rainforest, you have the permafrost systems. So this is today a recognition how dependent we are on nature. The red embers risk range here shows in deeper, dark color, higher likelihood of risk of crossing tipping points. The small circles show the average values. The top 5 are likely to cross the tipping points already at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But you have further down there, I'll come back to that, the Amazon rainforest, which climate science, as you see, assesses to be at risk at something between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius. And, an uncomfortably wide uncertainty range, but the midpoint is around 3.5. But ecological science shows that we are wrong in the climate science, that if we lose too much biodiversity in the order of exceeding deforestation or canopy loss beyond 25%, then the Amazon basin, the entire Amazon basin, is likely to cross this tipping point already at between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So here we have a proof point for the richest biome on planet Earth, on land, that if we combine biodiversity loss and climate change, we are at risk of pushing the system irreversibly towards an aridified savanna bush state if we cross that point. Now, how could this happen? Well, the feedback is so well known, as you all know. The negative feedback that holds this system in a healthy state is the moisture feedback, that 40% of the rainfall is convective rainfall, self-generated through a healthy canopy that holds moisture and pumps up fresh water through the rooting system. If you cut this down, opening up roads, cutting down large portions of the forest, it leads to so much dry air flowing through the system that that pump closed down. So that negative feedback, keeping the system intact, leads to a self-drying feedback, and the system flips over. So we need to become stewards of nature at the planetary scale. The Planetary Boundary Framework is a framework that can guide this. I won't go through this, just reminding that biodiversity is, I would argue, the second most important. All of them are important, but climate and biodiversity are the 2 of the core boundaries. We talk of 3 core boundaries, novel entities, climate change and biodiversity. Why? Because science shows that they can, on their own, knock over the planet, lose all life support and the biodiversity on planet Earth, and systems will not be able to regulate in a way that is conducive with human life. The 9 boundaries are well spelled out today. 6 of the 9 are in the red, as you see here. Only 3 are still in what we define as a safe operating space: ocean acidification, aerosol loading, air pollutants, and the stratospheric ozone layer. But unfortunately, the ocean is also moving in the wrong direction, and we're approaching the tipping or the boundary level for ocean acidification. We've recently published the Planetary Health Check in the New York Climate Week, showing in much more detail the state of all the boundaries. What you see here is that confirming the 6 of the 9 boundaries that are outside of the safe space, but also in these arrows, very worryingly, they're still moving deeper into the red. So all the nature boundaries that determine the resilience of the Earth system are outside of the safe space. So we have a weakened system, an unhealthy system, which is moreover drifting gradually further into the high-risk zone, which is the red zone. So overall, that gives us the possibility of making an assessment, if you put all these 9 together across a bar chart of uncertainty, of the spread of all these boundaries, and we place the Earth system in this planetary health check right at the edge of the yellow danger zone. So yellow is the scientific uncertainty range. Deeper into the yellow, you're in a danger zone. Cross that and enter the red zone, and you come into what we call a high-risk zone. This is both worrying news, but also in a way gives us, it's not good news, but it gives us some real impetus for action, because it shows that the window, while closing rapidly, at least according to this science, is still open. That we still have this remarkable planet, which under all the human pressures and all the signs of being weakened, is still standing, is still able to deliver a dominance of negative feedbacks. The forests are still absorbing carbon, despite all the signs of weakening. The ocean is still absorbing 90% of heat, despite all the signs of weakening. And we are not yet in the deep red on all the boundaries. So that is, of course, the call for action. Nature Positive has therefore emerged as a critical tandem to the climate quantifications. The Nature Positive agenda was formulated scientifically as follows: to have 2020 as the reference year and use that as a marker of from that point on, lose no more biodiversity, and use that as a measuring point, because we can today monitor the whole Earth system, so we can have 2020 as what we measure against. Nobody's saying, though, that we will be able to halt all loss of biodiversity at that point. So you see that dotted line goes below the zero line, admitting that we are in the midst of a decade where we continue to lose biodiversity, but the aim is to reach a net positive point by 2030, and then from there on, invest in restoring and regenerating. And a lot of science shows that this is actually positive to do. So that's why the term nature positive, to go from halting loss to shifting it to also regenerating and restoring. And personally, I find this very promising, that for the first time, we actually have quantifications, both for the climate planetary boundary, avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius, and for nature, a net zero loss 2020, net positive by 2030, supported by the global biodiversity framework of halting and reversing biodiversity. That's what all countries in the world have now signed on to, and have as a milestone for 2030, a 30 by 30 in both marine and land-based systems. So finally, we have quantitative measurements that can be scaled and monitored against for all economies in the world. And can this be a guiding principle? Well, I just put this on as a scientific confirmation that also economists see this as a real direction of travel. This is the Sir Partha Dasgupta Economics of Biodiversity report, which is one part of the trilogy from the Economics of Climate of the Nick Stern, 2006, Partha Dasgupta with the Economics of Biodiversity, which was then from 2018 or whatever it was. And then soon, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have the Economics of Freshwater, which will be released very soon. What you have here is Partha Dasgupta's conclusion that the economy must now operate within quantified, safe operating space of planetary boundaries. That is the way the economy needs to be guided to have a chance of keeping planet Earth in a nature-positive state for humanity's future. So it redefines sustainable development, that we now must start talking of prosperity and equity within a stable and resilient and life-supporting Earth system, quantified, for example, by the planetary boundary science. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Johan. Now I would like to invite Peter to share your reflection, how the business community actually now want to address it and to provide a solution space based on this and provided by this science knowledge.
Yeah, thank you, Naoko, and fantastic to see Andrew and Mark on my screen. I don't know if Johan did this presentation just for the two of you or whether we're also beamed into a room in Sydney, but it's in any case fantastic to see Andrew with a tie. I don't think I've ever seen that before, so it must be important. Anyway, great to see you. You know, this is now the third or fourth time I hear Johan present today. Forget the last few weeks. But I take I take three things away from it. The first one is, it's now 100% certain, scientifically 100% certain, that the weather events, the droughts, the floods, the storms, the forest fires we see will only get worse. 100% sure. So in Japan, with the typhoons, the floods, the storm that is now about to hit the shore of Florida, this will only get worse. The second thing that I took away from the presentations that Johan made is, even if by magic we were able to stop using all fossil fuels today, climate would still run away from us. We need to integrate the restoration of nature into our climate action programs. And those are two very important messages for business. One, the risks are built in the system and are getting worse. And secondly, the solutions require not just decarbonization, but nature and nature restoration at the same time. And so for business, which is relatively comfortable today to talk about decarbonization and climate action, not so comfortable yet about nature and nature action, we need to start thinking of this as one agenda, not two separate agendas. So we need to think about this on an integrated basis. The third thing that Johan has made quite clear, that there is the planetary boundaries and there are the just boundaries, the capacity that people actually have to adapt to the stress that we're putting in the planetary system. And so that's the third component that business needs to take on. Yes, we need to radically transform, but we must do it in a just way, in a way that we will bring people along, that we protect people who are vulnerable, but that we also take employees along as our businesses and business models change. So what does that mean for business? I made very clear speeches here today saying business needs to do three things, and I hope the two of you will carry that into your meeting as well when you continue your sessions in Australia. The first one is business must now have a very clear view on what are the physical risks in your supply chains. There is no business is able to talk about transition risks. There are very few, if any, businesses are able to quantify the physical risk as a result of weather events associated with climate change. And we have seen companies that have done the work which will show them that their profitability is at severe risk on a 5 to 10 year horizon. So these are deep physical risks, and companies must get on top of those. The second thing that business needs to realize is that the world will hold business accountable. That is, the initial step for that is through disclosure frameworks, ISSB globally, CSRD in Europe, and also here in Japan, frameworks are being developed. So if business is being held accountable by disclosing information about its climate or its nature impacts, business must first learn, how do I manage my performance? So that's a second important change for business. We need to manage carbon the way we manage money. We need to have performance, not just financially, but we need to also have carbon performance in our business. And the more able we are to manage our carbon performance, the easier it will be to disclose that information and to then get the capital market to be able to value that information. And last but not least, the third item that business needs to do, we need to boost up our innovation capacity to find solutions for climate and nature to make these transitions happen in a just way. And so the innovation power, the engineering power that business has now really needs to focus on decarbonized, nature-positive solutions that we need to bring to markets. And then beyond that, we need to radically rethink the economic incentives that capital markets, that financiers put into business. And so concepts like putting nature on your balance sheet are going to be radically important, because if we do not measure, if we do not value, then eventually the economic incentives won't be there to go as fast as Johan is telling us we should go. But the key message is, this is no longer end of the century type of difficulties. This is now and here, and business needs to be able to respond to that.
Thank you, Peter. Well, this nature on the balance sheet is kind of becoming a kind of keyword, code word, and I'm very happy to hear that, because it's also something that I and Mark and together with others have initiated that this year. So good that we have that recognition, and I really love to see this partnership growing. But one takeaway from today's discussion on this end is that the business also wants to see like simple, measurable, comparable metrics to go forward, or to reinvent capitalism. So that I'm really keen to learn from you on your end and in Australia during this Global Nature Positive Summit. What has been discussed and what will be discussed, and what is your expectation for today and the next 2 days? So over to you, your side.
Okay, so let me just frame the summit, and then I'll hand over to Mark to give, I guess, an outsider's take, a non-Australian take is probably the best way to put it, in relation to his reflections thus far. So the Global Nature Positive Summit has been in work in training by the Australian government for almost 2 years now, in conjunction with work that's being done by the Australian government to create a nature repair market. That enabling framework through legislation was passed earlier this year, and it creates an appetite for Indigenous communities, for civil society, for governments, for business, and certainly for finance to come in and begin the act of repair and restoration, which is the topic of the discussion over the next 2 days here in Sydney in Australia. Interesting that the comments made by Johan and actually Peter are being echoed in session after session, but the one that I want to draw upon is the one that Mark actually ran in plenary in front of almost 1,000 people in Sydney earlier today. And hand over to you to get some sense of what you have taken away thus far from the first full day of the summit, and what you have been putting into and hearing from both business leaders and government as you've been talking to them, because Australia, as you may appreciate, is a very different country from the last couple of years in relation to its attitude towards this issue, but more importantly in relation to the way it's creating a policy framework for business to take action. So, Mark.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome. Hello, everyone. I think one of the things, 25 years ago, Australia was the centre of the carbon markets. It was one of the first to start developing that. I think that coming back here now is really interesting when we're starting to talk about the Nature Repair Bill, and the first time that we're starting to look at some of these mechanisms to come back in. It feels like Australia is a good hotbed to be developing those. I think at the heart of all of this, and this has come through in every conversation, and this touches on what you were talking about, a just boundary as well, is people. And actually the Indigenous people and the knowledge of that and how that plays into this process. And I think, Andrew, that's been at the centre of many of the conversations that we've been having. We had a wonderful welcome this morning on country from Uncle Alan.
We actually had a session that started with Indigenous leaders from across the Pacific talking about the role or the interplay between nature and people, and how there was a disconnect. And what's fundamental about it was it happened before even the Environment Minister spoke. So we put Indigenous people at the centre of this conversation.
And I think one of the key things with that is one of the takeaways, and I've been talking to a lot of the Indigenous groups here about value. They talk about the value created, the value that they bring into a conversation, the knowledge that they can bring. But one of the comments I really came away with was, I want to be at the table, not on the table. and the idea of being able to make the decisions, not being the food being served. And I think that was really key. There are some really important business steps here as well. The Nature Repair Bill you mentioned. There's also been an announcement of the Environment Information Australia, where actually they're now pooling data across public, private sectors together. If we're going to address this, we need to have that information available. And so lots of partners coming into that, including a meeting I was at yesterday from the US, so from the White House, Canada, and Australia working together on national level accounting. Now, that sounds great in itself, but the signal that sends, particularly into Africa and Southeast Asia, we've already been approached by many countries there saying, if these three bigger countries are doing that, then this means something that we need to do. And that's at the national level statistical accounting. I think one of the important things, and building on what we've just heard, was the Nature Positive Initiative has also today announced the metrics that it's taking out for consultation. So Nature Positive isn't just an ambition, it's a practical thing that we need to achieve, okay? And these metrics here are about the change in extent and condition and intactness of ecosystems and the extinction risk of species. So there's been a big group of people working on that. That is going out for consultation now. And in January, the final output will be agreed. But this is really important that we have a common metric that we can all get behind here. And this has got to link in, Johan, to your work on the planetary boundaries. We've had the Science-Based Targets Initiative here as well, looking from a private sector basis. We've announcements from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.
New adopters.
New adopters that have agreed this here today as well. Another announcement, 52% of the oceans are now protected here. There's a big meeting tomorrow from the High Ambition Coalition, which is now also looking, Peter, you'll be pleased to know, at nature and people. And they're also bringing in the private sector into that conversation. And I'll be bringing some businesses into that as well. I think just to round this off for me, this has been a really important visit for me. We've got accountants. We had 4,000 accountants in Australia and New Zealand sign up.
That's a spreadsheet.
Yes, sign up to a meeting for us here. I mean, that's a massive number of accountants interested in this topic. And I know, Peter, you've said for many years, accountants are going to save the world.
Yes.
They really are active here and putting that onto the balance sheet. But we've also had big statements from businesses, from civil society and Indigenous groups. But the interesting thing here is that we have coming up the bioeconomy meeting going to be happening next year at the COP in Brazil. So when we get to that, that's going to be really important. The one after that, there's a bid now to bring that to Sydney. That will also be the year that the Biodiversity Conference of the Parties and the Climate Conference of the Parties is in the same year again. So we should be able to see whether we can align that here, and a lot of talk about bringing those closer together. And I think that would be really interesting. It'll be steps towards it, but we need to stop looking at these things in silos and start looking at them as an integrated approach. And just on that, we also at the Capitals Coalition launched last week an integrated framework that is starting to look across all of these issues and the trade-offs there, including some governance on how to do that. But I think the integration of the nature, the climate, and the people here, and the economy is going to be what really drives us next. And we've got an opportunity in Australia to be that testbed for that, Andrew, I think.
And he's hoping that we get COP31.
Yep, let's hope.
Back to you, Naoko.
Yeah, thank you. So exciting news. And when you said that 4,000 accountants sign up for what? So is that the sign up for the meeting as of today?
So that was to learn more about what we're doing here about the nature markets and things. So to get that many, though, accountants in core businesses interested in this topic shows that we're starting to go outside of our bubble of the people that we usually bring to these things into the mainstream bodies that we need to be talking to.
It wasn't to do Mark's tax return.
No, actually, that was my question, because then here at today's conversation, one of the items is how we can really mainstream nature as a kind of the backbone and the economy and development, and then how to change the entire ecosystem surrounding this market or infrastructure, including accounting. It seems to me a very, very important factor, and that's why I just jumped on that kind of conversation. Maybe on this end, and maybe Peter, you may have some questions or comments for them.
No, it's super exciting to hear that Australia is back in the lead, because you know, politics comes and goes in cycles. You've had a bad spot. It's great to hear that the environment is changing, and it's a country that has a lot of credibility. And I am given the opportunity to be one of the opening speakers in the high-level session in COP16 in 2 weeks from now, I believe, in Cali. And I'm intending to say that we should stop having separate COPs. We should bring them one, and I'll take your comments as Australia is willing to host both of them at the same time. So thanks for that.
Very supportive of that idea. It would be a wonderful thing. Yes, we are quietly confident that there will, and the rumours are out of this summit that there will be an announcement at COP29 about the host for COP31. So let's stay tuned.
Yeah, just to add to your... Yeah, just to add to the arguments to do this, we have, since quite some time, had a discussion with Simon Steele and the United Nations Framework Convention of the need to reform the whole climate COP process. And the starting point for that is very simple, is basically to say that it's time for the world to celebrate. We've now had 30 years of negotiations, and we should celebrate that all the legally binding text that we need to solve this problem is already now in place. So we don't need to spend any more time. We don't need to have 2 weeks of round-the-clock negotiations over commas and brackets to get a final statement on paper. We need to gather during much more focused and shorter time periods to focus on delivery. And countries should come to COP meetings to report on progress, to be accountable, to update their plans according to science, and to put money on the table and share innovations. And if you do that, you could do that in 1 week instead of 2 weeks. So of course you have space in Australia to host both COPs in the same amount of time. So it changed nothing for the delegations.
Not at all. And one of the things to highlight is the commitment that Australia has to its Pacific neighbours to host a COP that is inclusive of the Pacific islands and countries, including New Zealand and Tuvalu and Samoa and Fiji and Cook Islands, and it's just too many to enumerate. But hearing from them during the course of the last few hours about their connection with country, with nature, as an opportunity to address climate and biodiversity, I think has resonated quite strongly with an audience that perhaps thought that this was a conference purely about nature, but understanding that the nexus of climate and nature is one that we have to address in a far more complex and connected way than perhaps we had first thought of. And that's why we're excited that the summit has brought that idea to this particular moment in time, so that our future negotiations will take that into account.
And Andrew and Mark, with the conversations you're having there, here in Japan, we had meetings with business leaders, both here on the stage as well as separately in the Keidanren offices. People are very comfortable now measuring and managing their carbon, their CO2 emissions. The carbon accounting, Scope 3 avoided emissions are all concepts that are well understood. But when it comes to the metrics for nature and how to measure and manage those and eventually move towards disclosure, there's a lot more hesitation, or it's far less familiar for business. What is the sense in Australia on that topic? I know TNFD, I thought, was in your rooms as well. So what is the progress on that side? And the call is really from business here. Give us a few simple metrics to assess the materiality of our natural impacts, as that we can focus on those. Is there anything to report from Sydney?
Yes, and Actually, there's more support here. The markets here on some of the ways to measure are actually more mature than some other places. So there is still the call for the simplicity, Peter. There always is. But actually, there's more businesses stepping forward here than probably I expected, actually, to be able to try and address that.
I think it's because, and to take Peter's point earlier, that the appetite for institutionalizing climate risk into financial consideration means that nature becomes the logical next consequence of that, because if you're going to be collecting data on carbon, it becomes a proxy in a large sense towards nature in any event. The interesting thing is that the sectors that are most eager for it are actually resources and property and finance. And they are three of the biggest sectors in this country that are picking up on the need for this to be brought into book as soon as possible.
But we also had Telstra and other technological companies that are stepping forward.
Yeah, you saw non-usual sector players, like health and therapeutic goods company Blackmores, for example, making a strong advocacy argument in relation to their reliance upon marine culture in relation to their products, and therefore they have to bring that to book as soon as possible.
And I think the thing is here, coming as an outsider as well, is the connection to country and to land is very strong in the culture of the companies here. So for them, it's not so big a jump when you're always talking about country that you're in, when you're always talking about the role of nature anyway, then to report on it and to measure it is actually very natural. So this could be, Peter, a good basis for being able to take that out into other places.
Particularly as methodologies under carbon and both nature now have to take into account Indigenous methodologies and approaches. So I think we are the first country in the world to actually do that. And it will be interesting to see how that translates to other jurisdictions looking at how that plays a role as well.
That sounds amazing progress against maybe expectation that I thought that it's going to be very challenging to have that kind of advanced way of measuring the nature value. But apparently the conversation there seems to me that then actually it's going to be possible and it's desirable, maybe from your side. But is that possible, maybe from your point of view, how to really put a kind of monetized value is, if possible, or we shouldn't really aim at this and putting a monetary value on it? I'm just interested in, because at the end of the day, we want to see the natural capital on the balance sheet. I mean, economic decision making, and which requires a kind of monetary valuation. So I just want to hear from you if the conversation is advanced that way, or it's maybe too early to to say anything definite.
So I spent the weekend up in the Blue Mountains, which was absolutely beautiful. If you're coming here, you must go. But I spent it with 60 environmental economists who are all doing that. So the Katoomba group for 25 years has been working on that. They've been mapping the different market mechanisms. They're looking at how to get this into payment for ecosystem services and many other things. So there is a big group of organizations here. Not all perfect. We've still got a long, long way to go with all of this. And even though we're having some really good conversations with companies, there's an awful lot of companies that are not in the room. So I shouldn't give the opinion that this is all sorted. It definitely isn't.
No, but I would back that by indicating that Australia has had a long history in relation to natural markets, because we've had a water trading market for some considerable time. So particularly in the agriculture, food and ag sector, there is a certain sophistication and maturity around how you deal with a natural commodity, in this case water, and what that means to the impact upon rice growing or cotton growing, or even just regenerative agriculture as an opportunity. The interesting thing, though, is, as we said earlier, the appetite for bringing it to book, perhaps sooner rather than later, is something that, subject to the data equation and the challenges attached to it, there is a lot of interest to bring it about sooner rather than later. I'd just pick up on Nyoko's point around monetisation. The other big announcement that was made by our Environment Minister was that going forward, budgetary allocation and assessment processes at a federal level will now take into account environmental data. Now, this is the first time we've heard this. So water, some aspects of climate, and waste data will start to factor into the way in which we allocate our national budget towards our needs. And that's something that I think that from whether that's under the SIA or through the Capitals Coalition approach for a number of years, that bringing to book into the national accounts is incredibly vital for capital allocation for a country, let alone a company.
And that is really important as well. I don't know whether you have seen the report we brought out with Business for Nature a couple of weeks ago, but the perverse subsidies 2 years ago, $1.7 trillion. We've updated that report now with plenty of wonderful scientists behind this. It is now $2.6 trillion of perverse subsidies. No matter what we do, with all of these great initiatives, we're never going to be able to change things if the subsidies, and inflation is part of that, but we're never going to be able to change things if the subsidies keep on growing and they're perverse and they're driving against this action. So we must reform those subsidies, and the work that Andrew's just been talking about is a step towards that, because if we make that transparent in the budgetary processes of governments, then the perverse subsidies just don't add up anymore.
Yeah, that is actually one of the essence of today's conversation on this end, because we were talking about reinventing capitalism, and the one way goal is to how to internalize externalities into our system, so that then how to remove those unhelpful subsidies and how to, in a sense, penalize the bad thing, that then through policies, not just project by project, but through policies, and hopefully the global policies. So that is also the end goal of what we are trying to do here, and it will come up very clearly at today's conversation. Anything from our side? No? All right, actually from my side, actually clock said no more time, so that then it seems that it's almost the end of the conversation, but maybe from your side, anything additional, anything?
Nothing to add other than thank you so much for the opportunity of joining you at a seminal moment occurring in Tokyo and also a seminal moment happening in Sydney on exactly the same issue at exactly the same time. I think that tells you a lot about what are some of the most important issues of our time going on anywhere in the world at this very moment.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. Thank you so much for actually proposing this affiliated session. It turned out to be extremely useful, helpful, and exciting. So thank you, Mark, that bringing up that idea. And I think that this end also benefited a lot from this 45 minutes conversation. So good luck for the next 2 days and deliberation, and we will catch up after your conference is over. Thank you so much. Thank you.